The following is a presentation of Geekster Media.
Remember that show back then? Remember that show? Turn on the TV, time was always flying. Why did they have to end? So many shows you forgotten. Now that we've got a podcast, we can release all the shows from our hands. Yeah, will you be the most TV dudes you'll ever listen to? As long as we keep on talking sitcoms and cartoons from back in the day. Okay, we confess, we're obsessed, but we got a podcast to help you remember that show. Hey y'all, and welcome to episode 28 of Remember That Show, the podcast where we revisit the obscure, forgotten TV shows of the 80s and 90s. I'm former beauty pageant winner turned podcaster, Adam Pope.
And having a hard time deciding between antebellum velvet or mid-century modern wool curtains from my studio, I'm William Bruce West. As you can tell, we're going to be in and around the world of interior design this episode. But first, we have to go back to our own TV-obsessed childhoods in a segment we call Theme Song.
Yeah, so Will, the set decoration for designing women, I feel it's very 1980s. Even when it crosses over to the 90s, it still just kind of feels of that era. And I gotta ask you, in your mind, what is the most like 80s design choice for a home from TV in general? But whether it be color scheme, decor, furniture, electronics, like what is the thing about a house you're like, oh, that's so 80s?
Oh, that's a good question. Because I mean, like, if we watch anything today that's trying to mimic the 80s, they go overboard. You know, there's that meme about how, like, we think everything was neon when it was all just wood paneling, things like that. So it's like, honestly, like, when I think of just like stereotypical 80s, wow, there are two sets that come to mind. The first one's kind of a cheat, but it's the later seasons of Facts of Life when they open over our heads, which is their whole like Gadzooks Spencer Gifts kind of store. It's just like the 80s threw up on every wall of the set. But that's what they were going for. But we talked about this in the Out of This World episode that like when Evie has her 14th birthday and she dreams of like a perfect teen room, it is like the 80s. Like all the design choices, all of the furnishings, the weird accent art. And so these are very like niche things, because I know Facts of Life has an audience out there, but I don't know about Out of This World. Like we found a few of them, but like those are like the quintessential. And then there's like the Max, you know, like even though Saved by the Bell teeters the 80s to 90s, the Max is still a very 80s set. Like it is not 90s neon, it is 80s neon. But how about you? What do you think?
See, I'm right there with you. And honestly, for my money, the design element that is kind of in a lot of those things are the glass bricks as a retaining wall or a shower wall or a window or part of an outdoor patio design. Just these glass bricks were everywhere in the late 80s. Specifically, I was thinking of like the windows in the Max, you know, like you see those. But there were so many like fashionable, trendy 80s homes, you know, on TV and in real life that I was visiting as a kid. And it just always seemed like those glass bricks were everywhere. Not in my house, though. See, my family home was built in the 70s. We had like weird like wood vinyl flooring for years before my mom got tile and stuff like that, you know. So it's just like it was the very dark, you know, wood, you know, feel until like my mom did an overhaul in the early 90s, you know. But yeah, so for me, glass bricks will always take me back.
Those glass bricks don't really seem energy efficient either. Like if either of us were gonna have them, it was gonna be you in California, you know. But I'm just like, there's no way to properly heat your home with those things. But like another thing that really comes to mind mind is like shapes, especially triangles. Triangles were everywhere. And it was like the 80s was when they realized, like, wait, there's more than one way to have a triangle. Like, they weren't all like 90 degrees. It was like, oh, this one's obtuse. And it's like there were just triangles everywhere. And like,
Well, that and like, you remember like the trend of like vases? Like, some of them were big, some of them were tall, like, like oversized, like as big as the kid that lived in the house, and there'd be like a weird palm frond sticking out of it, or like a dried, like, looked like it belonged in a swamp, and there was like a bunch of them just sticking out of these pots everywhere. Like, that was a weird thing.
Oh yeah. This was pre-IKEA. This was when like we don't have money, so let's just go get a flarg and build that thing ourselves. But Delta Burke's character on this series is a former beauty queen, a fact that is brought up very often throughout its many seasons. So Adam, did you ever watch a Miss America pageant or other beauty pageant on TV?
Well, I feel like according to every TV show and movie I watched growing up, it should have been appointment television, for a heterosexual young boy looking for pretty girls in swimsuits to ogle in a pre-internet age. Like, everything on TV was telling me you watch a beauty pageant. And I'm like, I don't have any interest in this. Like, I remember seeing promos for like Miss America pageants on CBS or NBC or wherever they were broadcasting it. And I was just like, there's not going to be any lasers or robots or comedy during these 2 hours of TV. So I always skipped it. I'm going to go watch a goofy sitcom. That's what I want, Plus, like, by the 90s, Jesse Spano's talking to me about the sexist nature of the Miss Bayside pageant. And that pretty much clued me into the fact that that idea was going out of style. It's just like a beauty pageant maybe is not the best thing. Although, like, my wife has friends that still enter beauty pageants, middle-aged adult beauty pageants. I'm like, this is weird. Like, she's not interested at all. She's like, look what my friend is doing. I'm like, yeah, what is that? Will, you? I mean, you didn't jump in immediately and say yes. So.
I did. I was still bracing myself from the whole like adult beauty pageant thing. I was like, how is okay? Well, like, I mean, no, they weren't really a thing for me either, but mine's a little more like scientific in the sense that, like, for example, swimsuit competition. They're all one pieces and I'm a two-piece man. So right there, like, that just bored me. But like, honestly, the whole concept has always bored me, whether as a child or even in like puberty. Because to me, these and like bloopers and practical jokes were two like programs I loathe because they preempted something I wanted to watch. Like, those were, let's plug this in because the show is on a break, or it's like we didn't have like mid-season finales and junk like that back then. But it was really just kind of like, we're out of episodes, so let's put Dick Clark and Ed McMahon on here to laugh at some bloopers. I hated that, and I hated pageants. They just never were a thing. And then as you get older and you learn about like the sordid stuff with the pageants, and then like the Donald was involved, and this before even all that, this is when he's still like 80s billionaire, so it's like that was kind of tainted. And like the only one I ever had a passing interest in was like the Victoria's Secret, that fashion show. But that one's real sordid because like Miss America, Miss Universe, all that, they're still the like thin guys of like, okay, these women are representing their home worlds, their homelands to be the best in the country, the world, the universe, which is kind of rigged because no other planets are involved in that one. But like with Victoria's Secret, it's just kind of like, these are the like 15 hottest women who are paid today, and they're gonna wear lingerie for you. There's no talent competition. It's just like who looks the best in wings. So like they were never really a thing for me.
Yeah, definitely not. Some of those gals, they're competing, but they get the red light. It tells them, hey, you're done. Your time is up. Get off the stage. But we got to figure out how this series got the green light. All right, so female-led ensemble sitcoms were a TV staple by 1986 with programs like Laverne and Shirley and The Facts of Life, Alice, It's a Living, and most notably The Golden Girls, which had premiered the year before, showcasing the comedic talents of women whose characters were trying to make it through work, school, or their retirement years with humor and wacky schemes. Now, Designing Women was just one of several shows with female stars on the air at this time, including the TV adaptation of the movie 9 to 5 that somehow lasted for 85 episodes. Like it was network and then syndication. You're like, huh? Along with My Sister Sam, starring Pam Dauber, Mork and Mindy fame, Valerie Harper on Valerie or Valerie's Family. We've talked about that in the past. The completely forgotten The Ellen Burstyn Show, and even Lucille Ball making one last try at TV stardom on Life with Lucy. So there was a lot of women giving us some comedy in prime time, but yeah, it was just an interesting time to look at your TV guide.
But it wasn't just ladies getting laughs that was delighting television audiences. The allure of Southern culture was also a big draw throughout the decade. Whether it was primetime drama Dallas, the country courtroom wisdom of Matlock, the wild action of Dukes of Hazzard, or the many, many Civil War-based television miniseries like North and South starring Patrick Swayze, The Blue and the Gray starring Stacy Keach, or Beulah Land starring Meredith Baxter Birney from Family Ties. Adam, as someone growing up in California, what was your vision of the South based on TV and movies?
Well, I have to say, I did not travel to the South until I was in my late 20s. But as far as I knew growing up, everyone from Georgia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, or one of the Carolinas was probably a white racist who talked like the Clampett family, lived in a trailer park, worked as an auto mechanic or a sheriff. My mom loved Gone with the Wind, so I had a concept of that Civil War era version of the South, but I knew that wasn't the way things were in modern times. Although I do remember, so in high school, there was a girl named JC from Tennessee who moved into my neighborhood, went to high school with me, and she was so exotic in my mind. I was fascinated by her accent, and it did make her 50% more attractive than she actually was. And that's not to say she wasn't attractive, but I was just like, oh, that accent, you know? And then the way I saw it at that time is having a British accent made you sound smarter. Having a Southern accent made you seem sexy if you were a girl, or a total doofus if you were a guy. So that was my perception in the 90s of the South. This is what I knew. But Will, you have actual family connection to the South. You spent time there. So what is your experience?
Well, first off, I love that she sounded sexier to you. Like, it reminds me, there's like this episode of Boy Meets World, like right in the middle of the series, where like Eric is dating this. She's supposed to be a Southern belle, but she just turns it up to 11. Whereas like, there's no way she's actually from the South. But just how mesmerized he is by that accent. I'm like, wow, I guess that actually happens. I don't know. I'm in a very weird situation with this because, I mean, if you've never heard this show before and this is your first time, or you have heard it, I tend to have something of a drawl. But I didn't grow up in the South, even if Maryland is below the Mason-Dixon line. But my family is from Alabama. So I always say, like, I inherited this way of speaking. So it's been tricky because I grew up thinking I was in the North. Like most of us in this region, the Mid-Atlantic, think we're in the North, but like New York doesn't feel that way. Boston does, you know what I mean? Like about us. So I had Northern mentality about it. I remember one time distinctly because like you were saying, in this era, if they had a Southern accent, they were always like slow or dumb. And if they said something smart, it was so poignant, like it was to take you out of things. Like Park Overall was Laverne on Empty Nest, and she was always like just these colloquialisms that made no sense. But sometimes she'd say something really intelligent, and the audience is supposed to be like, wow, where did that pearl of wisdom come from? So that was kind of how I felt. So I remember one time we were watching like NBC Saturday Night, and I said something to my mom like, man, Southerners are so dumb. And like, she's like, what? Like, I completely had the disconnect of like, oh, like, yeah, you're not Southern anymore. You're not in Alabama, you know, like, you live here now. But it's like, I wasn't immune to to it, you know, like there weren't very many smart Southern characters. And when they were smart, that's the gimmick. It's like Matlock. Matlock's supposed to be like a kindly old, like Southern man. He's not supposed to be clever, but the show lasted like 8 years because this old Southern man managed to keep being clever. It wasn't like a one-off thing. So like I kind of fell into it too, of just like, and I just felt like you're saying, this era really showed us a different side of the South. Like In the Heat of the Night, you know, like In the Heat of the Night showed us like, hey, like there's some stuff going on down there that's not all like cotton picking and watermelon. So like it was a very interesting time for depictions of the South.
Yeah, so it's very interesting what our perception was thanks to entertainment and what it was delivering. So let's find out what Designing Women was bringing to the airwaves in our elevator pitch. So Designing Women was a CBS sitcom that aired for 7 seasons from 1986 to 1993, which was created by Linda Bloodworth Thomason, a TV writer who had written an Emmy-nominated script for MASH, episodes of the Mary Tyler Moore spinoff Rhoda, and even the original pilot for One Day at a Time. And her first sitcom about eccentric Southerners was a 1982 parody of shows like Dallas and Dynasty called Filthy Rich, which starred Dixie Carter and Delta Burke. And Delta Burke was actually offered a role on Dallas at the same time, but she had to turn it down due to contractual obligations to Filthy Rich, which was maligned by critics, ignored by audiences. Nobody liked it. And so Bloodworth Thomason created Designing Women, took a different tact on it, which was a sitcom telling the story of 5 women who ran an interior design firm in Atlanta, Georgia, which dealt with issues of sexism, race, homophobia, economic disparity, and more through humorous and often edgy dialogue. You think you know Designing Women. We're going to get into this. I don't know if you really remember Designing Women, but the series was such a big hit for CBS that Bloodworth Thomason produced another series concurrently with the final seasons of Designing Women called Evening Shade, which we mentioned on our Out of This World episode because it starred Burt Reynolds, and that one ran from 1990 to 1994. So, Will, do you have any memories of Filthy Rich? You were plugged in to TV, but was Filthy Rich on your radar at all?
These moments don't come often. I had never heard of Filthy Rich before researching this. No clue about it. And like even hearing about it, it sounds so derivative. It's basically Southern soap. And like I kind of hate that whole thing of like let's parody a popular genre, because it starts as like tongue in cheek, but to like stretch it out into a series, it turns into like low-hanging fruit. It's the same way like soap launched all these careers of like Billy Crystal and whatnot. It looked like this was supposed to do the same thing, but parodying Dallas and nighttime soaps as opposed to daytime soaps. I had never heard of this show, so I looked it up, and it's really interesting. I mean, you've got Dixie Carter and Delta Burke there, but you've also got Ann Wedgeworth, who I've always been curious about, because if you're a regular here, you know about my obsession with the Three's Company extended universe, and she starred as Lana in Three's Company when Mr. Furley takes over. She was supposed to kind of replace Mrs. Roper in the like sex-crazed middle-aged woman role, and she's constantly chasing Jack, but she just kind of disappears. There's no narrative reason for her disappearance, but then you realize timeline-wise, she disappears and then resurfaces on Filthy Rich. So, like, it's not that she necessarily left Three's Company for Filthy Rich. They say that she asked to be written out of her contract because they weren't doing anything with her character. But when she does return to a series, it is Filthy Rich. So now I need to, like, seek this show out and watch all 15 episodes. They say it lasted 2 seasons, but it has 2 pilots, and then it has 13 episodes. So this was my introduction to that. How about you?
Yeah, same for me. You know, and I did track down some clips that I was watching. And what I realized is, to your point, like it really doesn't work because it is almost too close to what it's parodying. it's like just as ridiculous and just as heightened reality as Dallas or Dynasty was. And so, like, yeah, you kind of watch it. And it was making me realize, too, when we were talking about the WB, when we did on Happily Ever After, there was another show. I can't remember the name right now, but it was supposed to be like a parody of like Melrose Place and things like that. And so it's just like, I don't know if this has ever worked where you take primetime soaps and you try to do a funny version of it. It's just like, no, just don't do it. It's a bad experiment.
Well, see, it worked for Soap. Because Soap had at least 5 seasons, and then it got Benson as the spinoff, which then had like 6 seasons. So it's like there's a historical precedent, but it only worked once. So people are like, well, if we created fire once, maybe we can do it again.
Well, tell us more about this show, though.
Well, this series starred Dixie Carter as the sophisticated and outspoken Julia Sugarbaker, and Delta Burke as self-centered former Miss Georgia World beauty pageant winner Suzanne, who were partners in Sugarbaker and Associates. These associates were Annie Potts as lead designer Mary Jo Shively, a sassy divorced mother of two, Jean Smart as the simple but sweet office manager Charlene Frazier, and after the first few episodes, Meshach Taylor as former convict turned delivery man Anthony Bouvier, who eventually becomes a full partner in the firm. After a very public dispute with the show's producers, Delta Burke, the breakout star of the series, left the show and was replaced by Sugarbaker cousin Allison, played by Julia Duffy, who was gone by the show's 7th and final season. This led to Judith Ivey joining the cast as brassy millionaire widow B.J. Poteet, who became a partner to help the firm stay afloat. Jean Smart also left the show during season 6 to spend time with her child and was replaced by Saturday Night Live cast member Jan Hooks, playing Charlene's equally naive sister Carlene. Alice Ghostley, as elderly friend of the Sugarbakers Bernice Clifton, was also given a larger role as the series progressed and cast members left the series. Adam, what is your history with designing women?
Wow, I mean, there's just so much there, so many names and familiar faces. But as far as I knew, growing up in the 90s, because I definitely wasn't watching it during its original run, Designing Women was a Lifetime original series because I would only see it during the summer in reruns on the Lifetime channel, Television for Women, as it was promoted at the time, right? So it was a cable rerun show. That's where I was seeing it. I'm sure I was vaguely aware of it, but I definitely was not tuning in. And I remember watching it, again, during those summers, and mostly for Meshach Taylor, because the women on the show seemed like office ladies that worked with my dad or my friend's mom, who was a professional, who worked in an office. Like, they were just not interesting to me. But if I had known that Janine from Ghostbusters was on the show, I would have tuned in more. But Annie Potts is just like unrecognizable between those two roles. I definitely became more aware of Designing Women being in the checkout line with my mom at the supermarket and seeing Delta Burke on every tabloid for 6 months. It was just like every story seemed to be about her. And then she became the new pop culture fat lady that every comedian and sitcom writer was making fun of. Like, originally it was Oprah, then it was Roseanne, and then Delta for about a year, and then I feel like it went back to Oprah again. Like, her weight keeps
Because Oprah was up and down.
Yeah. And so it was so weird, but like it was more familiar to me just from the controversy around it. And Delta Burke being like the breakout star and then the one with all the drama attached to her. But really, like, the show, I watched it, but as we'll get into when we get into Cheers and Jeers, like, I had a very different perception of what I remembered the show was. But what about you? Sounds like you were there when it was in broadcast, right?
Oh man, I loved this show. Because this is that like transition between like me being old man Will and me trying to like de-age myself. So like I was really into CBS sitcoms. Like, my favorite night of comedy was Monday Night CBS. Like, I was watching this and Murphy Brown like first run. I don't know what an 8-year-old got out of Murphy Brown, but I loved that show. So like I was there for this. They talk about like a balanced breakfast. Everybody watched The Golden Girls, but I felt like to get a balanced breakfast, you needed this too. Because The Golden Girls is like, it's equal opportunity. It's it's very accessible. Like, I feel like this kind of show wouldn't work that well right now. It would work as a streamer, but like networks, because middle America wouldn't like this kind of thing. This show is basically Golden Girls if you knew the name of your congressman. You know, there was like a class difference to it, and they made no bones about it because I mean, like, they were really swinging for the fences as like, this isn't the South you know of. Like, these aren't bumpkins, these are high class people. They still live on plantations, but they're working through that old stuff too. You know, there's a lot of class and race stuff between like Anthony and Suzanne. Like, that's really the heart of this show, which is why it kind of like falls apart when Delta leaves. But like, they tackle a lot of issues that the Golden Girls are past. You know, it's like they lived their lives. People forget the crux of the Golden Girls was that based on like the economy and 80s Reaganomics and all this stuff, these four elderly women couldn't afford to live on their own. Like, they found this ad that Blanche put up in the grocery store because she needed help with the mortgage and they couldn't afford rent on their own. But that's really where the social stuff stops. Otherwise, they're living like they're 20-year-olds and like that's it. But like, Designing Women dealt with some issues, and it dealt with like class and money and race, but it still made it funny. Now, it got kind of preachy at times, and we will talk about that, but like, I will say I gave up that last season because I was excited when Julia Duffy joined because I loved Newhart. I feel that her and Peter Scolari on Newhart are one of those couples that pop culture has just forgotten. Like, they had amazing chemistry, and everyone should go back. It's like prototypical, like all these like 80s yuppie couples that kind of became like a trope, but like they were the first. Like, I loved Newhart. So like, to see she was joining this, was like, oh, CBS vet coming aboard. But when she couldn't even save it, I didn't watch that 7th season. I was probably into like, I don't know what, Fresh Prince by that point, you know? So that's my history with it.
Yeah, because it's definitely one of those things, like I say, where you know the breakout star was Delta Burke. Like, she was the one that everybody was talking about, and she was like that was the strange thing too when I think about it, is like, you know, because the cast really was a great ensemble, but then her name was most associated with it, is what it felt like. She was like the Urkel, you know, of the show. She was the outrageous character.
She was, but I'll be honest in that, like, she wasn't the draw for me. There were two aspects that brought me to this show. Mannequin, because let's not forget Mannequin. Like, that's my Meshack. So the whole like run of this show, I'm like, is he gonna become that guy? You know, like, when's Hollywood showing up? But
well,
also,
I will say that, yeah, I totally conflated Hollywood Montrose with Anthony. You know, like, I was just like, yeah, he was like an out gay character in the 80s on TV. And then you watch the whole thing, he's like, no, he's with a ton of women all the time. That's a lot of the jokes, is he's dating multiple women. At the end, he's engaged, his fiance breaks it off, and then he gets together with a Vegas showgirl in the last season. Like, it's really weird.
He's with a ton of women, but it's just as forced as the uncle on Out of This World. You know, like, we'll talk about Anthony Bouvier, but really the draw to me, because we're talking about timelines here, Dixie Carter. Because Dixie Carter was Mr. Drummond's new wife on Different Strokes when Danny Cooksey joined. She played Danny Cooksey's mom as Sam. And I don't know if it was contract stuff or if the roles bumped up against each other. Because keep in mind, Different Strokes went to like 86 and then this starts. So when Different Strokes moves networks and has its final season, they replaced her with, oddly enough, a former beauty queen, Marianne Mobley, I believe it was. So Dixie Carter then resurfaces on Designing Women. So I'm really just following Mr. Drummond's wife to a new show. That's what that was for me.
That is wild. Well, let's get into it, Will. Let's talk about what made this show special, what made it really pop in our cheers. You were mentioning Murphy Brown earlier. this to me feels like a culturally significant show that I never thought of it as. I thought it was just jokes a mile a minute and silly Southern accents. That's what I thought it was, like in my mind. But the show really does feel like it was giving women a chance to see themselves on TV and characters saying the things that they always had to keep in check because of societal pressure. You know, it's like recently with the Barbie movie, it had a huge effect on my wife, especially, you know, America Ferrera has this speech about the balancing act that women have to do in juggling their many roles in society. And it feels like, is this a monologue that's going to stop the movie and take you out of it? But my wife was crying in the theater because she saw it like everything she always wanted to be screaming every day. She's an incredibly intelligent female doctor who doesn't get the same respect as her entitled, kind of lazy male counterparts who don't take care of their patients, you know? And luckily, her patients recognized the difference. She was just voted the best optometrist this year in our city based on a ton of unsolicited online reviews, you know? So bravo to my wife. But back to Designing Women, I could really see how this show must have meant a lot to working women who would have preferred to be able to talk back to people as confidently as Julia did to those that disrespected her staff at Sugar Bakers, you know, and it feels important in that way, but it also feels like because they were a group and it wasn't like a lone woman standing up against the gender norms of the day, like Murphy Brown, what Candace Bergen got a lot of heat, like back in the day, like they were a fortified group and it felt like they could kind of withstand criticism because it wasn't like one single character that the press or politicians or whoever could come after. They could speak their mind, but it was a group doing that in different ways on different episodes. So I just think like culturally that way, it must have really connected.
Oh, definitely. I mean, you mentioned that Barbie movie monologue, and that's a Julia Sugarbaker speech right there. You know, like that's one of the things that this show became known for. But then, like, if you kind of follow the behind the scenes, it's also kind of like a little funny joke to fans because while Dixie Carter was amazing giving those speeches, Dixie Carter was a right-leaning libertarian. So in many cases, she disagreed with the subject matter of the script, but she was so convincing at it. And they came up with this like quid pro quo deal where anytime she was required to give one of those like rah-rah feminism speeches, they were required to allow her to sing a song in a future episode. So it was just kind of like, it's like when big stars are like, I do the blockbuster so I can do the little ones that mean something to me. It's that same thing there. It's like, I'll say your I am woman, hear me roar speech, but you're going to let me sing opera next season.
There's a fun fact about Dixie Carter that like she wanted to be an opera singer as a kid, and then she had a botched surgery that messed up her voice. So she couldn't do it anymore, but she still was always singing as often as she could. So that's really interesting. One thing I thought you would love, you tell me if this is the case for you, but there is amazing continuity on this series. They refer to characters, they bring back characters. The history between like everybody in this universe is constantly referenced. And it makes sense because most of the scripts were written by the series creator. Like Linda Bloodworth Thomason is pretty much credited on almost all the scripts. It really does give the show a cohesive feel no matter the season. Like they'll do callbacks even to characters that they'll talk about Suzanne, even though she hasn't been on for 2 seasons and left acrimoniously, like they still reference them. So like, and you're somebody who loves to see they acknowledge the history. But what do you think?
See, I wasn't that guy then. I hadn't discovered comics yet. There was nothing I was consuming that was like an extended universe. It took me years later to realize, like, wait, Good Times is a spinoff of Maude, which is a spinoff of All in the Family, you know, like the Norman Lear multiverse. So, like, I wasn't there. I will say the one thing I always carried with me was how, like, there are 2 things that are constants, at least the first 5 seasons, of like, Suzanne has a pig and a gun, and that's important because Suzanne shot Anthony. Then they become this kind of like, it's almost an indentured servant kind of relationship. They're never equals, but over the course of the first 5 seasons, they get closer to the same footing. Because, I mean, when we meet Anthony, he's an ex-con, he's the black guy, it's Atlanta, it's the 80s. These people couldn't be more different, you know? So it's like they throw him some work as like their delivery man, but then like he comes to be like one of love them and family. And by the end, he's a partner, you know? But it's like to get in there, it's like, well, Suzanne has old world views and she thought he was breaking into the house. So she shot him because Suzanne has a gun and a pig. So they would always call back to, well, I'm here because you shot me, Suzanne. You know, like that kind of deal. But I would love to do like a full rewatch. I just dabbled for this because I told you, I was like, I'm shooting from the hip. Like, I'm fairly familiar with this universe, but like knowing what I know now, especially with behind the scenes stuff, I want to do like a full rewatch.
There is a big breakthrough episode with that relationship between Anthony and Suzanne when like they're trying to travel to this convention, but she's also going to this beauty pageant, but there's a huge blizzard and like she and Anthony like have to pull off the road and stay in this hotel together. And she like originally makes him sleep out in this freezing cold van because she's like, you know, it wouldn't be proper. People are going to think, you know, all this stuff about me and I'm trying to get my reputation back in the pageant world and all this stuff. But then ultimately, like, you know, she lets him come in, they sleep in the same bed. There's just a lot of comedy, but a lot of bonding. And then when they finally show up at the convention with all the other gals, like they are just like best buddies and they're helping each other. And everybody's like, what happened on that trip? And then later on, like Anthony will reference that. He's like, oh, and then, well, you guys never had to share a bed with Suzanne in a snowstorm, that type of stuff. Like, so again, the continuity is great there. And Meshack Taylor being able to hold his own with these very strong personalities where it is, the stars are the women. And then here he is, and he just fits perfectly with them. And again, he's not a gay guy. He's not written to be feminine in any way. Like he just is who he is. I will say my favorite of the female cast members, though, of the main cast, is Charlene, which we would say Charlene, but her name is Charlene. They always have the hard cha on there. And I'm just like, I didn't remember that either. But Jean Smart is great at straddling the line between being the dumb one or just the sweetly naive one who has simple wisdom that helps to bring her friends back down to earth. Like she feels the least heightened of all of them. She's not Rose from the Golden Girls, right? Like they're not going to slap her on the back of the head and tell her she's being stupid, you know? Like it's very much not that show either. But I do want to mention about that is that the whole series is less about sitcom style jokes. Golden Girls is like laugh a minute, joke, joke, joke. And Designing Women is like, it's like a one act play with fleshed out characters who happen to say or do funny things, but it's always character based. And it feels like there are very few setups and punchlines in this show. Just well placed zingers every once in a while, or Anthony does a lot of monologues and tells funny stories or tells stories about people, you know, that he's met and he's, you know, whether it was in prison or whatever, you know. It's also shot on film. So there's just a noticeable difference. I've brought this up on some other shows, but you perceive it as more, I don't know if epic's the right word, but it seems to have more oomph because of the visual presentation. It looks so different than like another, like again, the Golden Girls obviously shot on video. You can see how cheap it looks. Designing Women never looks cheap. And I'm always just like, wow, like that's pretty impressive. Again, for 7 seasons that they didn't ever have to switch, you know, drop the budget and go to video. So there's a lot of cool stuff going on there.
Yeah, you're right in that like Meshack was just a natural fit with them. So much so that in the beginning you said that it was 5 women, but it's 4 because he really he's another one of them.
Well,
you know,
Bernice, my wife was like, I love Bernice, and she's kind of in it a lot. But yeah, you're like the main cast though.
Bernice is the wacky neighbor, you know. And I agree with you. Like I was saying with Dixie Carter, there were a lot of reasons I was drawn to this show. One of which is Annie Potts. Like, oh, Janine from Ghostbusters is in here. But like she never gave us that energy. So then I found myself like drifting towards Charlene. And what made that even better is when Charlene meets and marries Bill, who is played by Douglas Barr, who I knew from The Fall Guy. So I loved any episode Bill showed up. He's always in uniform. He's an Air Force guy. Well, and I just love Douglas Barr. Like
the star-studded husbands and ex-husbands on the show. Scott Bakula, who's Mary Jo's ex-husband, deadbeat guy. And then you have Hal Holbrook, Dixie Carter's actual husband, plays her boyfriend for a while. And then Gerald McCraney marries Delta Burke, meets her on the set of Designing Women, and then they get married, and then he's showing up on a regular basis. Like, it is so wild just to watch watch like the real behind the scenes stuff, like mixed with the narrative and everything they were working on in that show. It's crazy. All right, was there anything else that you wanted to talk about that you loved, or do we have to get into some of the stuff they could have worked on to improve it?
We can get into the stuff they could have worked on.
All right, well, let's check out our jeers.
Boo! Boo! Boo!
Well, I mean, you brought it up earlier, Will. I would say, especially in the first two seasons, the show is very preachy. It's like Linda Bloodworth Thomason had a list of things that have been bugging her during her entire life, and she was going to vent that frustration every episode by setting up a scene where Julia could tell someone off, and then she gets big applause, and it just brings the show to a halt. It's almost like she was replaying a scene from her life, was restaging it, saying, this is what I should have said to that person. Like, it really feels that way. Like, they feel very personal. One thing, you and I have been talking about the idea of an agenda. On Out of This World, you said it had an agenda. And then we've been talking off mic, and you're like, an agenda is not necessarily a bad thing, despite maybe the connotation that word has these days. But these tirades, in some cases by these characters, they are packed full of agendas. It's like neon lights agenda. And that does take me out of the show. I'm here. Again, what I thought was for a few laughs. And then I got to think about hard issues. And it's like, no thanks. Like, that's not what I come to a sitcom for. And it's pitched as a sitcom. And I realized that a big part of that is, look, I'm coming from a place of privilege. I'm a middle-class white male. And this show is fighting against the patriarchy. I was born a part of this patriarchy. I can't deny that I benefit greatly from being a white man. But as a result, I do feel attacked a lot by the dialogue, even though I'm trying my best. Like, I'm sensitive to these issues being presented on this show and just life. I try to be a good person, but I feel like I would be a target for Julia. She would probably chew me out for not being a better husband to my wife, who's obviously, smarter, more compassionate than I am. Like, I could write the monologue that Julia Sugar Baker would pin me to the wall with, But on the flip side, again, a 30-year-old professional woman in 1986 is probably standing up and cheering in her living room at this show. And so I'm just like, I realize this series is not for me. I can't relate on any level. So I really did not enjoy watching this show and revisiting it. Like, I watched like multiple episodes throughout all the seasons, and I'm just like, they're definitely not writing this for me to enjoy. That's not what this is about. And I'm fine with that. There's plenty of things for me, but this was not.
So I got a sidebar then. How do you feel about, like I said, the Norman Lear multiverse? Because when you get to something like All in the Family, or especially Maude, or like even A Good Times, can you get the jokes, or are you alienated by the message?
I get them, but it feels like the point of those shows, and it was groundbreaking because of that, is the message and not the comedy. And I want to be there for the comedy. And so many of these shows have such a dramatic element to them, and such again, the agenda. Like, they're trying to get this across. Like, there's problems with race relations in this world, and this needs to be addressed. Let's have this character on here who's going to call it out and let Archie Bunker know he's a racist. Sammy Davis Jr. is going to come on and tell him about it, or whatever, like those types of things. So I totally get that. But I guess it's just, I'm not angered by it, but I'm not entertained. I'm not laughing. So I don't watch any of the Norman Lear shows. I don't like them. Like, they're not for me. I want stupid. I don't want social issue comedy, I guess is what it is.
And I think that's probably from like when we grew up, where like the social issue comedy stopped, and then we got the silly, but then they were peppered with the very special episode.
Right.
So it's like you knew you could skip the very special episode if you didn't want to see drunk Tom Hanks or something, like, you know what I mean? But it's like, other than that, it's just like wacky, no real content. So I get it. I mean, I think a lot of people probably felt like you did, because those first few seasons, the ratings weren't great. Like, it was a letter writing campaign that saved this show. Oh. And it had to be packaged with Murphy Brown to save it. So like, what CBS ultimately did was create this like strong feminist, almost girl boss block that really like helped both of them. But like, I mean, the same issues you had here, you probably were gonna have with Murphy Brown. You know, like it's on the list, so hopefully we get to it.
That's
Maybe
what I
we'll
said when I
just.
go back, because I watched a lot more Murphy Brown reruns, and I even watched broadcast episodes of Murphy Brown, but Designing Women I did not.
It could be revisionist history for me, but I feel like this was a show I watched with my mom, and like she got it. She wasn't like a captain of industry or anything like that, but it's just kind of like what women have to go through, you know? So I can see how it's like alienating. My whole deal is just like the show itself makes no sense. Well, let me back up. First off, Jeer number one. I don't like that the mythology surrounding the show has a stronger legacy than the show itself. I can rattle off all the behind the scenes mess that went on with that show, but like actual episodes, they come and go. Now that could just be a me thing, but it's like you were saying, like Delta Burke was always in the tabloids, and there are some great stories. I mean, my favorite is when Gerald McRaney got Major Dad and they started turning on the heat on Delta. He used to show up to the Designing Women set in uniform. So it's basically stolen valor. Like he would just stand there glaring at people because they thought, oh, this military guy is about to kirk out on us. He never served. He was wearing his costume,
He
you
wasn't
know?
going to wear his Simon costume. That looks
Right.
tough too, you know?
Right. An even bigger one, which, like, if this happened today, this would be like a huge scandal. But, like, it got to the point where CBS was going to fire Linda Bloodworth Thomason and her husband because they were co-producers on there. But they were close personal friends of Bill Clinton, who at the time was the sitting president of the United States. And they asked him to call CBS on their behalf to save their job, and he did.
Wow.
like I know we've turned a blind eye to tons of things, but like the world we live in right now is like that's the thing that would take down a president, not the like actual crimes and be like, oh wait, he called Les Moonves, like, you know. So like those are the things. But like when I watch this show, none of it. It's like you were saying how it's like this one act play and how it's kind of like epic in this scale. The set makes no sense. Like she lives in this mansion, she descends this, and you know what's funny is there are very few differences between the Designing Women set and the Nanny set, but the Nanny is more gaudy for some reason. Maybe because it's not filmed, like not shot on film,
Yeah.
but like she descends this staircase to her living room, which is her workspace.
Yeah, it's
There are
weird.
desks set up. So like, how do you entertain? Like, oh, just ignore the desks over there on the side.
I just
But then,
assume she must have another wing of the house that they never show.
I mean, it's a big house, so probably, but then you get into things like, okay, Mary Jo, she's allegedly the head designer. I can't recall anything across 7 seasons that showed she was qualified to be head designer of anything. She's scattered single mom. She's a great office gal. You know, it's almost like they came up with ranks and assignments after casting because, like, they're great office gals, and that's gonna sound condescending, but like as a workplace comedy that takes place in a mansion in Atlanta, they've got great chemistry and banter. But then when you get down to like, if you really read the like character breakdowns, so Charlene was the secretary of Julia's dead husband, so she contributed half of her life savings into, like, she invested into Sugar Bakers, I guess because she believed in Julia being the widow of her old boss, but as kind of like a hey, thanks for your investment, they make her the office manager,
Yeah.
you know? And
Not
then
a
it's like,
partner. Yeah.
right. And then we know that Suzanne has no official role in the company. She's just there for like investment sake, you know? But it's like there's no, even though I know Sugar Baker and Associates is an interior design thing, I can't remember a single episode where that mattered. And I was reading the synopses and apparently it figures into the series finale, but I don't remember like, oh, we got this job to do the governor's mansion, or it gets down to like the micro level of like, oh, Anthony's got to go pick up these swatches. Like it does that, but like ultimately, like how are you paying your bills? I'm a big proponent of like, don't ask how people are paying for their rent. I hate when people are like, how do the Friends afford this apartment in New York City? But here it's like, this is a workplace comedy where I don't see a lot of work going on. And I don't
that's
understand.
true. And there are, like, if you look at the synopses for the different episodes, there are like 2 or 3 episodes each season where it's like the girls get a job to decorate this, or they have to work for this type of person, or this person, disrespects them and their design abilities. But the majority of it, yeah, is their outside lives and being office gals. And I have to say that leads in kind of to my other jeer, which is the main crux of this show is the cast complaining about other people in their lives, ex-husbands, clients, teachers of their children, whatever. They sit in this living room and they complain. And I hate complainers. Like, again, as a privileged individual who doesn't have a lot to complain about, that sounds bad, but I avoid negative complainers as much as I can. At past jobs.
I'm like, hey, audience, this is why Adam doesn't call me when we're not recording.
No. See, it's different. I knew you were going to think that. There's a difference when it's like well thought out, clever, funny stuff. And then there's just like the office gossip who complains about everybody behind their backs, or the person who's steeped in negativity. And that's what I just feel like most of the show ends up being. And so I tune out. Like, again, it's not for me. Like, I will say this, female relationships and friendships are very different. Having been married for many years, like traditional female friendships, I feel like are based on being listened to, having someone validate your feelings. If you marry a woman, that transfers over to you, like as the husband or whatever, the spouse. Like, my wife will tell you, I'm still working on not being a solution guy who just wants to get rid of the problem as fast as possible. But in my experience, it's just so different, because a traditional male friendship, we tend to explain things to each other from a place of perceived authority, right? We say how much we remember about a TV show from 40 years ago, or poking fun at each other, or showing off our favorite toys, occasionally asking advice for how to handle something in a relationship or home repair or something from a buddy, but like, so a show about female friends and coworkers supporting each other by allowing the others to vent, it sounds like a lot of complaining to me. I hope I have not lost all our audience, but like, so
we got one woman listening to this thing,
that's true.
And she cut out after Out of This World.
But yeah, I've outed myself as a sociopath who doesn't understand human relationships, so we can move on. But I'll just say that's just another factor I just had to reflect and say, that's why I don't like this show. Like, really, I don't want to hear them complain about their lives. So.
No, I get it. And I guess this is one of those self-examinations where I come to terms with, like, I'm not normal. Like, I always knew I wasn't, but like, I was raised by women. So I'm just kind of like, that didn't seem weird to me, like that seemed normal. But that's another kind of jeer, though, where like I feel that the workplace chemistry and banter is something that is built over time when trust is established. And that's why when the cast changes start happening, the show really suffers, because you can't do a nepotism swap in. Three's Company tried that, where it's like, okay, Chrissy's gone, here's her cousin Cindy. It's a cheat, because the audience is told that, well, since this person is related to the character you just lost, they still have familiarity with what has happened because of family reunions or letters home or that kind of deal. So it's like the character can show up on the doorstep and be like, oh, Jack and Janet, I know all about you from Chrissy's letters. And it's the same here. It's like, we don't get to know Carlene. It's just kind of like, hey, you knew Charlene. If she was good enough for you, then here's the next best thing.
Poor Jan Hooks was given an impossible task, because she is nothing like Jean Smart at all. She doesn't come in filling that role other than being stupider. Like, I'm literally the stupid one, and I'm clueless, and I don't know the relationships, and I'm trying to insert myself like I was always here. Like, she was great on Saturday Night Live because she's playing multiple characters an episode for 3 minutes at a time. But in this one, she's locked into a character who's not well written, and she didn't find a good hook in the performance. And so I feel so bad for her every minute she's on screen. It's like, she never had a chance, like, to really earn our love.
I wish we could do like spotlight episodes because I feel bad for Jan Hooks in general. Once she left SNL, she did a lot of heavy lifting characters like Third Rock from the Sun. You know, like
Yeah.
she worked her ass off on that show and shouldn't have had to. Like she really shouldn't have. But like, you're right. And I mean, I think that Julia Duffy was a good foil for them. She comes in as like the conservative New Yorker. She's still a sugar baker, but like she's not that kind of sugar baker. And there's still the tension that Suzanne had brought to the table. Again, like we're too smart for TV. There's too much just easy storytelling here of like, oh, Suzanne's gone. She sold her shares to her cousin and she moved to Japan with her mom, who we met back in season 2, who just happened to move to Japan. Okay, there's some continuity. Then when Julia Duffy leaves, she sold her shares to nobody. I'm not even in investing, and I know you just don't flip shares like you know what I mean? Like after a year, there's due diligence, and I never got into BJ to the point where like I can't even remember what she looks like. Like I was so done with the show by that point because they weren't even trying to explain like why we have this revolving door of characters. It really probably should have ended at season 5. But like my biggest jeer, then because I'm taking a lot of time, my big jeer is Anthony Bouvier.
Really? Okay.
The same way that I said out of this, and I'm starting to feel like McCarthy over here because I'm on this like witch hunt. Like the same way Out of This World was filled with too many men, Anthony Bouvier is gay. He is. I guess they felt they were pushing enough envelopes as it was. Anthony, it's the only way the show makes sense. I haven't seen a character, like, especially in that era, he is the biggest gay-coded character since Jim J. Bullock's Monroe on Too Close for Comfort. It is clear what is going on here, but they're like, we already got Dixie speechifying over here. We got Delta shooting black guys and living with a pig over here. There's only so much we can do, CBS. So I just feel like we got to be honest with ourselves. They needed to be honest with the characters and the show they were trying to make. Until I read Linda Thomas's book, which I'm sure she's written one, Anthony Bouvier is gay to me. And anytime they tried to give him a love interest, it was the most forced thing I have seen since like anytime they give Stewie a girlfriend on Family Guy. Like I'm just not believing it.
I think it's a situation, yeah, like you say, where they weren't ready for that. But like I said, I understood that. Like that's how I remembered him. So like however subtle they were being, it still came across. So, and maybe that's just me, Shaq Taylor, just came across that way. I don't know. We talked about this show when we were teasing it last time that everybody remembers Designing Women. It ran for so long. But I think there are these elements. People do forget all these things, how preachy, how intense it would get over those seasons, and how kind of a mess it was at the end. So I think we've clearly defined that for people. But the question is there anything to be done by the show doctors? I looked at the show and I was like, the only way I could make it for me would be to write an entirely different show. So I am defeated. It ran for 7 seasons. It worked, which is probably, I mean, again, it got a little reprieve from presidential involvement, but like it was probably one more season than it should have had. But to me, like as a doctor of TV here, this operated on holistic medicine, and I'm more of a traditional physician. So it worked for them, but I don't get it. And so like, it's like, if you're fine and you're healthy, that's great. But like, I have no advice to give you that you would want to hear to change your ways.
You're like, you take your chakras and you get out of my office. It had a good run. You know, like my only thing is like, if it wanted to be like honest with itself, you admit that Anthony's gay. But I don't keep it going then. 7 seasons, that's a run back then, you know? At that point, if they got an 8th season, that's when you add a kid or a baby. And like all those broads were in no place for a kid or a baby. Like they did add like a niece around like season 5, and that didn't really work too well. But I would love to revisit it. I don't know how you do that. I mean, like, I wouldn't have kept it going then. I would totally give it the Fuller House treatment. We've lost Anthony. We've lost Julia. Delta doesn't really act anymore, but Gene Smart's winning awards and Annie Potts isn't turning down work.
Yeah.
I just don't really know. Like, I don't know what the angle is. It's funny because, like, I said it's like a smart show, and that's TV speak for, like, low rated because they think that, like, middle America hates intelligent shows. But every time it's a smart show, Arrested Development, 30 Rock, oh, it's such a smart comedy. Those are low rated shows. Like, they want the Big Bang Theory. I can't take it in that direction, but I also can't single cam it. So I think it dies on the table. Like, I hate to do that, like, but
it becomes a subject of study at a medical school. You know, you look at it and you look at, here's all the behind the scenes drama. Don't do that. Here's the cast changes. Don't do that. Just let it die earlier. You know, don't call the president to keep it alive a little bit longer because it's just not necessary at this point, you know.
Let's bring it full circle, though.
Yes.
Because that is one way you could do it. And I already said I hate this, but it wouldn't be a parody, but you make a show about making a show. Kind of like Studio 60 or 30 Rock, where you make a show about designing women, but the actual, like, crux of it is, oh, the president's on the line. You know, like, the focus isn't like the episode. You might only see like one scene of that, but it's really about what goes into making an issue-driven, envelope-pushing sitcom on network TV in the late 80s. Like, that is your show. It's a meta exploration of things. So it's like, you still get the sets, you still get the hairstyles, you still get all that. You're not going to have cell phones and all that, but, like, it's another angle of what was going on there. It wouldn't be a straight multicam sitcom.
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be really interesting, and I think that would connect. And you could bring back the legacy actors, but maybe they're now playing a producer or a writer on the show. You know, they're not part of the cast, you know, but they are senior executive, although I don't know how many female executives that they had at CBS in the 80s.
I'm sure there was one that everybody knew her. She was Mixie. You know, like, I don't know. That's what they went by back then. Yeah, no, you could do it. I remember, like, 30 Rock did an episode where they were really trying to do a night court reunion, and they just bring back, like, the surviving night court. You know, it's like you parade them through the studio, but, like, it wouldn't lean into parody because we've established I hate parody, but it would be an exploration. It's not leaning on humor per se, although there will be humorous moments.
Sure. Now, here's the thing, Will. We've talked about how politically charged this show was. We talked about literal politicians being involved in keeping it alive. Now, the interesting thing about continuing the Designing Women universe is that it did happen in 1995. For a single season, Delta Burke starred as Suzanne Sugarbaker in Women of the House. Never heard of it? Well, you are going to hear all about it on episode 29. That is the whole reason we talked about Designing Women. I discovered Women of the House and said, Will, what is this? We have to talk about this. And he's like, we got to give the backstory of Designing Women. And then we get into its sequel series, this spin-off. This is wild. I have watched this show. I have so much to talk about next time. I can't wait to discuss it with you. It's going to be fascinating.
I can't wait because I think I saw maybe the pilot, and that was 30 years ago.
All right. Well, we will prepare for that. But in the meantime, prepare to stay connected with us on social media at Remember Show Pod. Of course, you can share the show around, let people know. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Designing Women. Again, some of the shows we cover more obscure. This one you probably watched. We'd love to get your thoughts. So you can find Women of the House. It's actually on Amazon Prime right now. So if you're subscribed there, you can find it. But it is out there. It's also on the Fandango at Home app. That's how I discovered it when we were watching Team Knight Rider. I said, what is this show? And so there are places to view it for free. So you'll be able to be prepared if you've never heard of it. But there are a lot of familiar faces on this show as well. So when you tune in, you'll be like, oh, wow, I didn't know this before they were on this show. Okay, great. So this is going to be a wonderful conversation. We thank you for checking out this episode. But until next time, we're changing the channel.
This has been a presentation of Geekster Media.